We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're continuing our economics chat from tariffs, inflation, housing markets. We're going to get to the housing markets, I guarantee it, with Andrew Moran. Andrew, thanks for sticking around. Now, we briefly touched on the inflation issue in the last segment. And you point out inflation is roughly 2.6% at time recording, which is, it's a fairly manageable if it stays static. But let's talk about the core inflation thing. So less food and energy. What's that looking like?
Well, that's a bit more sticky and stubborn. That's still around
Sure.
3%, which is it hasn't been below 3% since the coronavirus pandemic. That's gonna be the issue for the Federal Reserve and fiscal policymakers. And then the other factor, which of course the funny thing with the Federal Reserve is that it keeps changing its mind is what's the key inflation metric they're using. Because for a long time there was another metric they were using, and I think you and I have talked about it, or I mentioned on my Swaponomics TV program, was that they have something called the super core inflation rate.
Yes, super core
which is
inflation.
Core inflation subtract housing services. That's also been trending a bit upward over the last few months. So it's hard. So there was a great interview recently on CNBC. This was before the election. So with a gentleman named Kevin Warsh. Kevin Warsh, he's the presumed successor to Jerome Powell to helm the Fed in a couple next year. And he was saying the exact same thing, is that the Federal Reserve has lost credibility because you're not really sure what it's concentrating on. So if, let's say there's one inflation metric that reaches whatever, let's say the 2% target, but then it changes mind, say, okay, no, but now we're going to focus on this part of it before we do anything else. Under Janet Yellen, her thing was wages. So they all just keep changing their mind. And it's very hard to determine, okay, well, it reached here, so why aren't we cutting, or why aren't we raising, or shouldn't you be worried about this inflation measure because it went up? So it's all just, it just seems like the Federal Reserve doesn't know what the heck it's doing.
There's something in geopolitics and warfare that you would call strategic ambiguity. And it seems to me that the Fed has an array of data tools that could be used to explain things very, very clearly to the public and to give comparisons. Because if you keep the same core numbers, you end up with a decent comparison over time. But it seems that they'd rather obfuscate and make things different depending on what makes the Fed look competent at the time. Or am I a little conspiratorial with that?
No, well, I think in a way you were correct, just because of the fact that, for a long time the Federal Reserve was operating in the shadows, whereby it didn't really talk to the press. It didn't have these monthly press conferences like Jerome Powell has had, or for a long time that Ben Bernanke, for a little bit of time that Ben Bernanke had. So when you watch these press conferences, it's always, okay, so Jerome Powell, do you think the Fed's going to start raising interest rate or cutting interest rates next month? I don't know. We haven't really focused on it. But then let's use this as an example. In December 2023, I think it was, up until that month, Jerome Powell would say, yeah, we're going to keep policy tight. We're not cutting at all. And then Joe Biden said, okay, now the Fed should be cutting interest rates. A week later, Jerome Powell says, I think now is the time to start considering cutting interest rates. But what happened in a 10-day span for the Federal Reserve to cut something to tergiversate and say, okay, now it's time to start easing policy? And so in the last meeting, Jerome Powell, he actually shifted his tone and said, okay, so we may start considering cutting interest rates at the next meeting, or the June meeting. But up until that moment, what was interesting is that he would constantly say, well, we haven't looked to the next meeting yet. What the heck? How could you make these statements in such a short amount of time? Why could you change it? Maybe I'm just focusing too much on it because I watch every single month, and I read the transcripts of previous meetings.
Well, so everybody's got to get their kids to sleep somehow, Andrew. But it seems to me, and do correct me if you think I'm being unfair to Mr. Powell, it seems to me that he's playing politics. And if there's a president that he approves of, he will be more accommodating. As you pointed out, Joe Biden said it's time to cut, and then he turns around and says, yeah, it's time to cut. Whereas with Donald Trump says it's time to cut, and he goes, we're not cutting. And so then Trump launches this full-on trade war through the tariff tools, and he's trying to force Jerome Powell's hand. And Jerome Powell, could have cut rates because even if it was just a fraction, it would have given some positive indicators of where the country's going. But it seems to me that he's playing politics. Am I being unfair?
Well, I've read this extensively over the years. The Federal Reserve maintains a vast history of playing politics. The Federal Reserve pretty much does whatever the White House wants. Let's use 2019 as an example. Right before the pandemic, Trump was saying constantly, cut interest rate, cut rates, cut rates, cut rates, and Jerome Powell. What did he do? He followed through on this and cut interest rates 3 times when there's absolutely zero reason to do so. And what's interesting, why did he do that? According to his justification, if you read the transcripts for his post-meeting press conference at the time, he said because of what? Slowing trade flows. So if these tariffs ignite slowing trade flows, then of course, then the Federal Reserve, based on that justification, would have to start cutting interest rates. Now, at the same time, you have to give them some, you have to give them some leeway because now you have elevated inflation risks as for the last couple of years. So of course you can't just easily cut the interest rates, but you just have to look at everything in the context and see how the Federal Reserve is just all over the map.
Let's carry on with the why it's important, why it seems important that interest rates come down, because obviously we discussed this in the earlier segment that once there's I'll just reiterate for those who didn't catch the first part is that there's $9.5 trillion of US debt that needs refinancing. And if that can be refinanced at as close as possible to zero, it will save trillions of dollars for the economy and be a major boon. But the other thing is it actually impacts day-to-day average Americans in such a fundamental way that I don't think it can be I don't think it can be overstated how important it would be for Americans. Now, I'm just going to do a little tick off list here. Massive credit card debt across America. Buying houses is next to impossible for most people. Getting basic loans is, I mean, you can get them, but you're going to be paying them off for the rest of your life. Your grandkids are going to be paying those off, much like the US debt. But if there's a cut in interest rates, all three of these things, at the very least, get some easing and accessibility. Do I have that about right? Come on, educate me, Andrew. For those of you listening on radio, Andrew did this big sigh, this big eye roll, and took a deep breath to start educating me on what Milton Friedman or Ludwig von Mises might have said about such things.
Okay. So yes, the Federal Reserve, it does directly influence short-term interest. So the federal funds rate impacts, let's say, the credit card interest rates. The Federal Reserve indirectly influences, let's say, mortgage, because you and I have discussed the mortgage rates. They tend to track the 10-year Treasury yield. Auto loans, they tend to track the 5-year Treasury yield. So yes, on the short term, it would be beneficial to people in credit card debt to have lower interest rates. But if you have 0% interest rates, that's going to fuel more debt. That doesn't benefit anyone in the long run. If more people are taking on debt because interest rates are zero, then that's not going to solve long-term economic issues for the country. Just like the federal government. Yes, it's great. You slash interest rates to have lower debt servicing costs, but that's still going to fuel the government to spend. That's going to give them credence to spend more money as they wish. Another thing too, if you slash interest rates, you do revive the long-term inflation risk, because what happens is when you cut interest rates, as you saw during the coronavirus pandemic, you add to the money supply. It grows. Why do you think the money supply has been growing since the Federal Reserve slashed interest rates in September? So, because when you slash interest rates, you increase money supply. So that erodes the purchasing power of the American people. So once again, it's a balancing act between, do you want to threaten the long-term prosperity of the country, or do you want a quick fix of zero interest rates?
I think it comes down to there's only one side of this equation that has the duty to be fiscally responsible. So if an individual has credit card debt, and then there's an easing of rates, they can either pay off that debt or they can borrow more. That's up to them, right? That's their decision, because they're not really affecting anybody outside of their immediate family. Whereas the government has a responsibility to, let's call it, its shareholders, right? The shareholders of the United States, and they have a responsibility to, when the money's cheap, pay down They have that responsibility. They don't use it, as we're all aware, which is why there's 30 odd trillion in debt. They don't use that. But it's currently under the current administration, and it might work, it might not. But there's this massive push for reining in government spending.
Mhm.
And if there are short-term benefits to that, coming back to your point, sorry, Andrew, if there are short-term wins to that, whether that's political wins, whether we actually see, I'm not that optimistic of seeing the national debt come down, but if we see it slow down to the point where for all effects and purposes, there's a reversal happening, even if there's not an actual reversal, then that gives an impetus for whoever's the next president to carry on with that, doesn't it? So the short-term benefits to the one entity in this equation that needs to be responsible would actually turn to long-term benefits if the short-term benefits become so immediately apparent.
But that assumes you have optimism for the next administration to carry on.
Sure.
Trend.
Everything's political. Yes, you might get some random socialist from California, I'm not naming names, who comes in and decides, hey, this money's cheap. It's about time we paid reparations.
Exactly. That's an excellent point. So so a few things here. So so one measure you should be watching is the deficit of GDP. So the ratio of deficit to GDP. That's about 7%. That's never happened outside of a pandemic, outside of a financial crisis or a war. If you lower that, and Scott Bessent, he has this 3 arrows growth plan, and one of them is to lower that ratio to 3%, which is quite interesting. But for a lot of during the campaign trail, a lot of the Trump surrogates, they would say about growing the economy, and this is the last time the United States has the opportunity to expand the economy to get itself out of the national debt. As we've seen time and time again, yeah, you can grow the economy, but it's not going to rein in the government spending or balance the books or cut down the national debt, and that's going to be the issue. As you and I have discussed before, 2/3 of the federal spending is all on the mandatory side.
Yeah.
Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, Trump, all the other administration officials, they say they're not going to touch that except for the waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, how much that accounts for Social Security spending is probably, in my guess, very minuscule. So the Congressional Budget Office, which its track record is questionable, considering, I shouldn't really say questionable, but the way it scores things is the concern.
Let's say it's as reliable as Jerome Powell at the Fed.
Well, its numbers are pretty good. You look at its long-term projections, and you see how there's such steady increases on the mandatory side. That's going to increase. That's going to increase about 70% of federal spending. A lot of this is happening. Why? Population is declining. People are getting older. There are fewer people in the workforce, so it's going to be very hard to pay to sustain the program and ensure everyone keeps their benefits and nothing gets cut or nothing gets eliminated. And that's going to be the challenge, because as you see now, even just talking about the very things that DOGE has proposed, stop paying checks to 120-year-olds. That causes so much chaos in Washington and national protests, and one side of the aisle is just complaining all the time. So it's quite a challenge. And from reports I've read, Trump has said, I don't care. I'm just going to do what I do, because it's his last term in office. So kudos to him if he's willing to take a chainsaw to the budget.
Let's talk about that chainsaw after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.